Board the plane before I make sure you disappear completely, you pathetic bitch.
Gerald Voss hissed. Emma Carter stood at gate 14 with a neck brace digging into her jaw and a bruise darkening under her left eye. 6 months ago, she found a pattern of medication errors that led straight back to a decision Voss made to save money. She documented it properly. She reported it the right way. Voss buried the report, then told the entire hospital she was unstable instead. That morning, when she refused to sign his final statement, his security team dragged her out of the building. She hit a doorframe on the way. Nobody stopped it. Voss just watched. Now he stood beside her at the gate, making sure she boarded a flight he'd arranged himself, making sure she disappeared quietly. Emma looked past him. A Marine lieutenant colonel sat near the window, reading a newspaper, waiting for an unrelated flight. Emma's fingers moved once at her side, a small, silent signal, the kind only a combat medic would ever recognize. The newspaper stopped moving. Gerald Voss had no idea his entire morning was about to fall apart. Before we start, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from, and hit subscribe. Because a hospital administrator was about to find out he picked the wrong nurse to threaten. Board the plane before I make sure you disappear completely, you pathetic bitch, Gerald Voss hissed, leaning in close enough that Emma Carter could smell the expensive cologne he wore like armor. She didn't answer him. She had learned, across 6 months of watching her own life get dismantled one signature at a time, that answering him only ever gave him more to work with. She stood at the gate in ordinary clothes, a plain gray sweater and jeans instead of scrubs, because this wasn't a shift, and it never would be again. A foam neck brace pressed into her jaw, a bruise darkening slowly under her left eye, a single carry-on bag resting against her leg like the last remaining piece of a life she hadn't chosen to leave. To anyone glancing over, she looked like a woman who had been in some kind of accident. Nobody in that terminal knew how close that guess actually was. 6 months earlier, Emma had noticed something wrong in the medication records on her floor, a pattern of adverse reactions that kept surfacing in patients who'd been switched, without much announcement, onto a cheaper generic formulary. She traced it back far enough to understand it wasn't random. It led directly to a cost-cutting decision Gerald Voss had pushed through the hospital board 4 months before the first bad reaction ever showed up on a chart. She documented every instance carefully, the way she documented everything, and filed a formal report through the proper channel, expecting the proper channel to actually work. It didn't. Voss buried the report somewhere it would never surface again. And then, with the same careful precision she'd used to build her case, he began building a different one, that Emma Carter was unstable, unreliable, prone to fabrication, a nurse whose judgment could no longer be trusted with patient care. He said it quietly to the right people at the right times, until it stopped being a rumor and started being a fact nobody questioned. That morning, when she refused to sign a final statement that would have closed the matter permanently and protected him completely, his security team had walked her out of the building, the way you walk out someone dangerous rather than someone right. One of the guards gripped her arm hard enough to bruise it. She pulled back instinctively, lost her balance, and caught the edge of a doorframe with her neck and the side of her face. Voss stood in the hallway the entire time, arms folded, watching it happen, without lifting a hand to stop it or start it, which Emma had come to understand was somehow worse than either. He'd arranged this flight himself afterward, framed it to the few people paying attention as a generous parting gesture, a fresh start for a woman who clearly needed one. What it actually was, and what Emma understood with total clarity standing at this gate, was insurance. A plane ticket designed to put enough distance between her and the state medical board that her testimony would never matter to anyone again. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to give Voss the satisfaction of watching her flinch, and let her attention drift instead across the rows of waiting passengers, a woman reading a paperback, a father chasing a toddler near the window, and near the far wall, a man in a Marine Corps uniform sitting with a newspaper folded in his lap, silver at the temples, a light beard tracing his jaw, waiting for a flight that had nothing to do with any of this. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his rank beyond what the insignia told her. What she knew, instantly and completely, was the particular stillness in how he sat. The stillness of someone who had spent considerable time in places where stillness mattered. The same stillness she used to carry herself before she'd spent 2 years teaching her own body to forget it. Voss caught her glance and stepped closer, his voice dropping into the low and threatening register he saved for moments when nobody else could hear him clearly. "Don't even think about it," he murmured. "You're nobody now, just a fired nurse with a bruised face and a story nobody's going to believe. He's not going to help you." Emma didn't look at him. She didn't look directly at the Marine either, because looking directly at him would have meant something different, something that could be seen and questioned and stopped. Instead, she let her hand fall to her side, out of Voss's line of sight, and moved her fingers once. A small, precise motion. 2 fingers pressed briefly against her palm and released. The kind of signal that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent time learning it in a place considerably harder than this terminal. The newspaper stopped moving. The Marine didn't look up right away. He didn't react the way a stranger reacts to a stranger's small gesture, which is to say he didn't react at all, in any way a casual observer would have caught. But something in his posture had changed. A shift so slight that only someone trained to notice small shifts would have registered it. The particular tightening of a person who has just received information they weren't expecting and are deciding, in the space of a single breath, exactly what to do with it. Voss noticed something too, though he couldn't have said what. He glanced toward the man with the newspaper, then back at Emma, his confidence flickering for the first time all morning, in a way he would have denied completely if anyone had asked him about it. Emma kept her eyes on the departure board, her carry-on bag still resting against her leg, her breathing steady in the way she had trained her breathing to stay steady in rooms far more dangerous than this one. She had spent 6 months being told, by people with far more authority than they deserved, exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth. She had spent 6 months absorbing it, documenting it, waiting for someone with the power to actually read what she'd written. She didn't know yet whether the man across the terminal was going to be that person. She only knew that for the first time since Voss had cornered her in that hallway, something in her chest had loosened by a fraction, the particular and fragile feeling of a door that might, possibly, still be open. Then she heard it. The soft, deliberate sound of a newspaper being folded closed, section by section, with the unhurried precision of someone making a decision they didn't intend to reverse. Voss heard it too. He turned his head toward the sound, and Emma watched the color drain out of his face in real time, because the Marine lieutenant colonel wasn't rising to walk toward his own gate. He was walking straight toward Gerald Voss. Voss's composure lasted exactly as long as it took the Marine to close the distance between them, which was not very long at all. He straightened his jacket and arranged his face into the same practiced concern he'd been performing for the gate agent 10 minutes earlier, the warm and reasonable expression of a man who had nothing to hide and every intention of being helpful. "Sir," he said, extending a hand that was not accepted, "I'm terribly sorry if there's been any disruption. This young woman has had a difficult few months, medically speaking, and we've been doing everything we can to—" The Marine didn't let him finish. He raised one hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just with the specific finality of a man closing a door that had barely been open, and Voss's sentence died somewhere in his throat. He introduced himself simply, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ellison, and then he did something Voss clearly hadn't prepared for. He turned his full attention to Emma and asked her, directly, whether she was safe. Nobody had asked her that in 6 months. Not the hospital board, not the security guards who had walked her out that morning, not a single person in the building she'd worked in for 4 years. Emma felt the question land somewhere underneath the neck brace and the bruise, and the careful composure she'd been holding since the moment Voss first cornered her in that hallway, and for a second, she wasn't entirely sure she trusted her own voice enough to answer it. She managed one word. "No." Ellison's expression didn't change in any way a stranger would have noticed, but something in his shoulders settled, the particular settling of a man confirming something he'd already suspected the instant her fingers moved. Voss opened his mouth to reassert control of the conversation, the reflexive habit of a man who had spent months believing control was simply his by default. And Ellison looked at him with the flat and unhurried attention of someone who had heard this exact kind of sentence before and had stopped finding it persuasive a long time ago. Voss tried anyway, because trying was the only tool he had left. He explained, with the same smooth and rehearsed cadence he'd used on the security team, the board, and everyone else who'd ever needed convincing, that Emma had a documented history of instability, that she'd made increasingly erratic accusations against hospital leadership, that this flight had been arranged as an act of genuine compassion from an institution that simply couldn't risk her continued presence, given her deteriorating judgment. Ellison listened to all of it without interrupting, the specific and complete patience of a man letting someone finish digging before pointing out the hole. When Voss finished, Ellison said only one sentence in response, delivered without any particular emphasis at all. That's exactly what they said about the last nurse who tried to report something at that hospital. Voss's face flickered, a small and involuntary crack in the polish, and Emma watched it happen with the specific recognition of someone who had seen that exact crack appear once before, in a parking garage, in a hallway, in a corner office where a man who was supposed to protect patients had told her instead that she was destroying his hospital's reputation. If you've ever been the only person in a room who could see exactly what was happening while everyone else was told to look away, drop "never judge" in the comments right now, because what Ellison was about to hear from Emma was going to change how he understood everything he'd just watched. He asked her, quietly, how she'd known the signal. Emma hesitated for exactly as long as it took to decide that 6 months of silence had already cost her enough. She told him about Danny Reyes, not the tactical account, not the clinical language of an after-action report, just the plain truth of it. A triage call made under fire. The correct decision by every measure the investigation had ever applied to it, treating the casualty, who could still be saved, before the one whose wounds gave him no realistic chance. Danny didn't make it. The investigation cleared her completely, documented her judgment as sound, the outcome as unavoidable given the information available in that specific and terrible moment. She told Ellison that being cleared on paper had never once reached the part of her that still ran the numbers some nights, the part that still wondered whether faster hands might have changed something the official record said couldn't have been changed at all. Ellison didn't offer her sympathy, and Emma understood, in the way she understood most things about him within minutes of meeting him, that sympathy wasn't what he was built to offer, and wasn't what she actually needed from him anyway. He simply told her that the Corps had lost people the exact same way, more times than anyone wanted counted, and that carrying it afterward wasn't a flaw in her. It was the cost of having done the job at all. Voss, watching this exchange unfold in front of the gate agent, and a growing number of passengers who had started to notice something was wrong, made the decision that would end whatever remained of his composure. He lunged, not toward Ellison, but toward Emma, his hand closing around the strap of her carry-on bag with the sudden and desperate motion of a man remembering, too late, exactly what she'd been documenting on the phone inside it. The gate agent gasped. A nearby passenger pulled out a phone to record. Ellison moved between them before Emma had fully processed what was happening, not with violence, just with the calm and immovable positioning of a man who had spent considerable time putting his body exactly where it needed to be. He didn't raise his voice when he told Voss to step back. He didn't need to. Airport security, alerted by the gate agent moments earlier, arrived at a fast walk from 2 directions at once, and Voss found himself suddenly surrounded by exactly the kind of official attention he had spent 6 months making sure Emma would never receive. He started talking faster, his voice climbing, insisting this was harassment, insisting he had attorneys, insisting the woman in front of him was dangerous and delusional, and completely without credibility. Ellison didn't argue with him. He simply reached for his own phone, and as he did, his eyes moved briefly to Emma's carry-on bag, still clutched in her hand, the strap Voss had grabbed for still slightly stretched from the pull. Something in his expression shifted as he looked at it. Not suspicion of her, but the specific and rapid recalculation of a man who had just watched a hospital administrator lunge physically at a fired nurse in the middle of a public airport terminal over the contents of a bag, and understood, in that instant, that whatever was inside it mattered considerably more than anything Voss had said so far. Security closed the last few feet of distance, hands already reaching for Voss's arm, and in the sudden noise and motion of the terminal reorganizing itself around them, Emma heard, faint but unmistakable, the sound of an unrelated commotion breaking out 3 gates down. A woman's voice calling for help, sharp and frightened, cutting through everything else happening around them. Security had Voss by both arms within seconds, his protests climbing into something closer to shouting now, and the gate agent was already speaking rapidly into her radio, while a small crowd of passengers stood frozen in the particular stillness of people who have just watched something they don't have a category for. Ellison kept his attention on the officers long enough to confirm Voss wasn't going anywhere, gave them a short and clear account of what he'd personally witnessed, and then turned back toward Emma with the intention of finally getting the full picture from her directly. That was the moment the woman's voice reached them from 3 gates down, sharp and frightened, calling for anyone who could help. Emma was moving before she'd fully decided to move, the neck brace still pressing into her jaw, her carry-on bag left behind on the seat where she'd set it down without thinking twice about it. She reached the gate at a fast walk that didn't quite break into a run, the specific pace of someone who had learned a long time ago that panic wasted seconds she couldn't afford to waste. An elderly man was slumped sideways in a row of seats, his wife gripping his shoulder with both hands, repeating his name in a voice that had already started to crack. Emma dropped to her knees in front of him and took in what she needed in a single pass. The drooping left side of his face, the arm that had gone slack against his side, the slurred and fragmented sound coming out of him when he tried to answer his wife's question. She didn't need a chart or a monitor to know what she was looking at. She'd seen it before, in hospital hallways and in far worse conditions than this one. And her body responded to it the same way it responded to everything that actually mattered. Calm, exact, immediate. She asked the wife his name, kept her own voice steady and clear, the same flat and unhurried cadence she used with every frightened family member she'd ever knelt in front of. Frank, she said his name and asked him to squeeze her hand, watched the right side respond and the left side lag, confirmed what she already suspected, and told the gate agent who had followed her at a run that she needed paramedics now, that this was a stroke, that every minute mattered more than the one before it. The agent relayed it into her radio immediately. Emma kept Frank's wife talking, kept Frank's attention on her voice, elevated his position slightly, checked his pulse directly rather than trusting anything else in the moment, and did all of it with the neck brace still cutting into her jaw and the bruise under her eye still darkening, as if her own injuries had simply been filed away somewhere they wouldn't interfere with the only thing that mattered right now. Ellison arrived at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered, having followed her the moment he understood what was happening, and he stood back the way people stand back when they recognize competence and understand their job is simply to stay out of its way. He watched her work with the same attention he'd give an operation he trusted completely, and what he saw in the next several minutes told him more about who Emma Carter actually was than anything in a service record could have. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice never rose. She gave instructions to bystanders in short, clear sentences that assumed no confusion and left no room for hesitation. Someone to bring a blanket, someone to keep the aisle clear, someone to tell the paramedics exactly which gate when they arrived. She talked to Frank the entire time, treating him as a person still present and still capable of understanding her, rather than a body to be managed. The same instinct Ellison had seen in every genuinely good medic he'd ever served beside. The paramedics reached the gate within minutes, faster than Ellison would have expected from an airport this size, and Emma gave them a report so precise and complete that the lead paramedic glanced up at her with the specific look of someone recalibrating an assumption mid-sentence. Onset time, symptom progression, baseline vitals, everything they needed delivered in the exact order they needed it, without a single wasted word. They loaded Frank onto a stretcher, his wife walking alongside gripping his hand, and as they moved him toward the exit, Frank's eyes found Emma's face for a moment, and though the left side of his mouth wouldn't fully cooperate, something in his expression managed gratitude anyway. Emma stood slowly, her own composure holding through the adrenaline the way it always had, and only once the stretcher had cleared the gate did she allow herself to feel, for just a moment, how much the last few minutes had cost her on top of everything else this particular morning had already asked of her. Ellison didn't say anything right away. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he has just fully understood, without needing a single page of documentation to confirm it. He'd read her file the way any officer reads a file, Names, dates, outcomes, the clean and bloodless language of institutional record-keeping. But nothing in that language had prepared him for what he'd just watched with his own eyes. A woman with a neck brace and a bruised face, hours away from being exiled by a man determined to erase her, dropping to her knees for a stranger without a second of hesitation, giving orders with the same calm precision she'd probably given them in rooms Ellison could only imagine. He told her, quietly, that he'd served with medics in 3 different theaters over 2 decades, and that what he'd just watched belonged in the company of the very best of them. Emma didn't have much of a response ready for that. She simply nodded, because there wasn't anything left in her at that moment to do more than nod. They moved together to a quieter row of seats near the windows, away from the gate agent's ongoing conversation with airport security and the last of the dispersing crowd, and Emma finally reached for her carry-on bag, the one Voss had grabbed for less than 15 minutes earlier. She opened it and pulled out a slim folder she'd carried with her through every version of the last 6 months. The original incident reports, the medication logs she'd copied before anyone could alter them further, dated photographs of discrepancies between what was charted and what she'd personally witnessed. She laid it out for Ellison methodically, the same unhurried and complete precision she'd used on Frank's paramedics minutes earlier, walking him through exactly what she'd found and exactly how Voss had buried it. Ellison read through it in silence, his expression hardening slightly with each page, the particular hardening of a man encountering evidence considerably more damning than anything he'd expected when he'd simply been trying to catch a connecting flight. He was still reading when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and something in his face changed before he'd even answered it. Not alarm. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man realizing a coincidence was about to stop being a coincidence. He answered it briefly, said very little beyond confirming his own name and current location, and listened for what felt to Emma like considerably longer than the length of the call should have allowed. When he lowered the phone, he looked at her for a moment before he spoke. The same measured stillness he'd carried since the moment her fingers first moved at her side, back at gate 14. "That was someone from the State Medical Board," he said. "They've had an open inquiry into Meridian General for 2 weeks. They didn't have a name to attach it to yet." He paused, and Emma felt something in her chest go very still, waiting for whatever came next. "They do now." Emma sat very still for a moment, turning that sentence over the way she turned over everything that mattered, waiting to feel some version of relief, and finding instead a kind of cautious disbelief, the specific and familiar suspicion of someone who had been disappointed by institutions before, and had learned not to trust good news until it had actually finished arriving. Ellison must have seen some of that on her face, because he didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurance. He simply told her, plainly, that the medical board had been investigating a pattern of complaints tied to Meridian General for 2 weeks. Anonymous, fragmented, nothing solid enough yet to act on, and that her folder, dated and documented the way she'd built it, was exactly the kind of evidence that turned a fragmented inquiry into something that could actually move. He asked if she'd be willing to submit it formally, with her name attached, understanding fully what that would mean for her going forward. Emma looked at the folder in her hands for a long moment. Then she said yes, because 6 months of silence had already cost her everything silence was supposed to protect. The airport security officers returned a few minutes later, having finished processing the incident with Voss, and one of them asked Emma directly whether she wanted to press charges over the injuries from that morning. The arm, the door frame, the neck brace she was still wearing. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to realize the answer mattered less to her than the medical board inquiry did. She told the officer she wanted it documented, formally, as part of the record, but that her priority was making sure the medication error pattern reached people with the authority to stop it from happening to someone else. The officer nodded, the specific and respectful nod of someone recognizing a priority he hadn't expected from a woman who had every reason to want something angrier. Voss, still detained nearby, watched this exchange from several feet away, with the hollow expression of a man who had spent 6 months certain of his own untouchability, and was only now beginning to understand how completely that certainty had been misplaced. He tried one last time to reassert himself, as Ellison walked past him toward the security office to give a formal statement, calling out that this was a misunderstanding, that he had resources, that people who mattered would be hearing about how he'd been treated. Ellison stopped, turned, and looked at him with the same flat and unhurried attention he'd carried the entire morning. He told Voss, without raising his voice at all, that the people who mattered were already on the phone with the state medical board, and that the only resource likely to matter to him in the coming weeks was a competent attorney. Voss's mouth opened and closed without producing anything, the specific and complete silence of a man who has finally run out of sentences that work. Airport security led him toward a private office to await transport for the security incident, and Emma watched him go without any particular satisfaction, only the tired and settled feeling of watching something long overdue finally happen. The following weeks moved with the specific bureaucratic slowness of institutions, doing careful work rather than fast work. The state medical board formally opened its investigation into Meridian General, using Emma's documentation as its foundation, cross-referencing her medication logs against hospital records that this time nobody had the authority to quietly alter. 2 other nurses, encouraged by the fact that someone had finally been believed, came forward with their own smaller pieces of the same pattern, filling in details Emma's own reports hadn't captured. Gerald Voss was placed on administrative leave within the first week, then formally terminated once the board's preliminary findings made his position untenable, though the fuller legal consequences of his actions would take considerably longer to work through the system than the 6 months it had taken him to destroy Emma's reputation in the first place. Emma didn't attend most of those proceedings personally. She had already given her account, in full, to the people who needed to hear it, and she understood that some parts of this process simply required patience rather than her continued presence. Frank, the man from Gate 14, recovered well enough over the following months that his wife tracked down Emma's information through the airport and sent her a card. Simple, handwritten, thanking her for the minutes that had apparently made all the difference to how completely he recovered. Emma kept the card in the same drawer where she eventually filed away the neck brace once she no longer needed it. Not because either object mattered enormously on its own, but because together they marked the specific and complete turn her life had taken on a morning she'd expected to end in exile instead of vindication. Lieutenant Colonel Ellison stayed in occasional contact, mostly brief messages checking on the progress of the investigation, the kind of steady and undramatic loyalty Emma had come to associate with the very few people in her life who had ever actually meant what they said. 3 months after the State Medical Board completed its investigation and formally cleared her name, Meridian General reinstated Emma under an entirely new hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia Ilves, who had been brought in specifically to rebuild what Voss had spent years quietly damaging. Emma went back to the same floor, the same rounds, the same medication logs, though this time with the specific and hard-won knowledge that the system had, eventually, worked the way it was supposed to. She didn't talk about the airport much. Most of her co-workers had heard some version of the story secondhand, the details growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling the way stories always do, and Emma let most of it stand uncorrected, because correcting it would have required more energy than the story itself was worth to her. It was a new hire, barely a month into her first nursing job, who finally asked her directly one slow afternoon at the nurses' station, half joking, whether the rumors about the airport were actually true. The Marine, the secret signal, the CEO getting hauled away by security in front of an entire terminal. Emma looked up from the chart she was finishing, considered the question for a moment the way she considered most things, and then told her the truth, in the same plain and unhurried voice she used for everything that actually mattered. She said she hadn't done anything particularly dramatic. She'd just written down what she saw, kept writing it down even when nobody wanted to read it, and refused to stop, even when refusing to stop cost her almost everything. The new nurse looked at her for a long moment, the specific look of someone recalibrating what quiet competence could actually contain, and then went back to her own charting without pushing further, because Emma's answer, plain as it was, had clearly told her everything she needed to know. If this story reminded you that the quietest people in a room are sometimes carrying the most important truth nobody else is willing to hear, subscribe and stay with us. Every week we tell another story about the ones who kept writing it down, kept speaking up, and refused to disappear quietly. We are not finished telling them.